Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. The Confession Chamber. From the private journal of Father Marcus Vaughn. October 31st, 2024. The confessional booth of St. John Bartholomew's has become my purgatory, a narrow chamber of mahogany and worn velvet, where the sins of Baltimore's faithful are whispered through a screen that separates the penitent from the priest, though I have begun to wonder whether it truly separates the damned from the divine, or merely one sinner from another. Tonight, as the autumn rain drummed against the stained glass windows with the persistence of accusatory fingers, I sat within that cramped sanctuary, listening to the familiar litany of human frailty, adultery, theft, pride, envy, the eternal catalogue of moral failures that has remained unchanged since Augustine first catalogued the varieties of human corruption. 20 years I have occupied this sacred office, 20 years of hearing confessions that blend together like watercolors in rain, each individual transgression dissolving into the greater portrait of humanity's fallen nature. Mrs. Chen's weekly gambling addiction, young Timothy's struggles with lustful thoughts, old Mr. Rodriguez's bitter hatred of his neighbor's success. They flow through my consciousness like a river of culpability that threatens to drown what remains of my own soul. But tonight brought something different. Tonight, as the cathedral bells chimed 9 o'clock and I prepared to close the confessional for another evening of solitary whiskey in the rectory, a figure approached my chamber with footsteps that seemed to echo, not from the present moment, but from some distant realm where time moves according to different laws. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice that emerged from behind the carved screen was unlike any I had encountered in 2 decades of priestly service. It carried within its cadences an archaic formality, as if the speaker had learned English from dusty theological texts rather than living conversation. The words themselves were spoken with such deliberate precision that each syllable seemed weighted with significance beyond its apparent meaning. "How long has it been since your last confession?" I asked, following the prescribed ritual that has governed this sacrament since the Council of Trent established its current form. "Time," came the response, "is but a construct of mortal understanding, Father. In the realm where guilt resides eternal, moments stretch like centuries, and centuries collapse into the space between heartbeats. I confess to you sins that have been committed and sins that shall be committed, for in the eyes of divine justice, all transgression exists simultaneously in the eternal now." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening seeping through the church's ancient stones. The voice spoke with the confidence of one who possessed knowledge beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. Yet beneath its elaborate formality lurked something that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. "Tell me your sins," I said, though my voice carried less conviction than usual. "I have taken life, Father. Not in the heat of passion or the desperation of circumstance, but with the cold deliberation of one who serves as instrument of divine retribution. At the hour when darkness claims dominion over the temporal realm, when cathedral bells announce the arrival of 3 in the morning, I have delivered Margaret Sullivan to her eternal judgment through the sacred communion of blade and flesh." The words hung in the air between us like incense that had turned rancid. Margaret Sullivan. I knew the name, though I could not immediately place it among my parishioners. The confession continued with descriptions so vivid and specific that they seemed less like admissions of guilt than reports from a correspondent covering events in some distant theatre of war. "Her heart," the voice continued with meticulous precision, "received the blessed steel as a chalice receives wine. 3 wounds I delivered, 2 to ensure the body's cessation, and 1 to complete the sacred trinity of justice. She dwelt in apartment 4B of the Riverside Arms, where the walls are thin and the neighbors pursue their own sins with sufficient vigor to mask the sounds of righteous judgment." I found myself gripping the arms of my chair with such force that my knuckles had turned white. The level of detail was extraordinary, not merely the admission of murder, but a complete blueprint of the crime rendered in language that transformed violence into sacrament. Yet the voice displayed no emotion, no remorse, no human feeling whatsoever. It spoke of taking life with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might use to describe a routine procedure. The authorities, the voice continued, shall discover her mortal remains when Mrs. Patterson arrives tomorrow morning to share tea and gossip, as has been their Thursday custom these 7 years past. They will find the door unlocked, for I am not a thief who skulks in shadows, but an instrument of divine will that requires no concealment from mortal justice. I attempted to interject, to ask questions that might clarify whether I was hearing the confessions of a murderer or the delusions of a madman, but the voice continued with implacable authority. In life, Margaret Sullivan presented herself as a pillar of Christian virtue, attending daily mass and organizing charity drives with the enthusiasm of one seeking to purchase salvation through good works. Yet she harbored within her breast a secret that corrupted her every prayer, every act of apparent devotion. She allowed her son to escape justice for the death of young Maria Santos, that child who was crushed beneath wheels guided by intoxicated hands while walking home from her first communion. Margaret Sullivan chose maternal love over divine justice, and in doing so, she made herself complicit in the spilling of innocent blood. The confession continued for nearly an hour, delivered in the same archaic, ceremonial language that transformed murder into ritual and violence into sacrament. When it finally concluded, the voice requested absolution with the same formal courtesy one might use when asking directions to an unfamiliar address. I cannot grant absolution for murders that have not been committed, I said, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. If you have truly taken a life, you must surrender yourself to the authorities and make restitution to. The sins I confess transcend the jurisdiction of mortal law, Father. I seek not the forgiveness of men, but the acknowledgement that justice has been served according to divine will. Grant me your blessing, and I shall continue the work that heaven has appointed. Before I could respond, I heard footsteps retreating from the confessional booth, measured and deliberate as a funeral procession. By the time I emerged from my side of the chamber, the church was empty save for the flickering votive candles and the stone saints who gazed down with expressions of eternal judgment. I spent that night in my study, alternating between prayer and whiskey, trying to convince myself that I had encountered nothing more than an elaborate hoax or the ravings of a mentally disturbed individual. Yet the specificity of the details haunted me: the apartment number, the neighbor's visiting schedule, the precise nature of the wounds described with surgical accuracy. When morning arrived, I found myself walking to the Riverside Arms with the grim purposefulness of a man approaching his own execution. The building squatted on Charles Street like a monument to urban decay, its facade stained with decades of Baltimore's industrial exhaust and human neglect. I climbed the stairs to the 4th floor with legs that seemed to move independent of my conscious will. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway outside apartment 4B, her face pale with shock and her hands shaking as she spoke to a police officer whose badge identified him as Detective Williams. Through the open apartment door, I could see the chalk outline that marked where a human life had ended, the dark stains on carpet that would never come clean, the evidence markers that transformed a modest living space into a crime scene. She was just lying there, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice broken with grief. Door was unlocked, which wasn't like Margaret at all. She was always so careful about security. And the wounds. God in heaven. What kind of monster would do such a thing? Detective Williams noticed my approach and identified himself with the weary professionalism of a man who had spent too many years cataloguing human cruelty. "You're from the church?" he asked, noting my clerical collar. "Father Vaughn, from St. Bartholomew's. Mrs. Sullivan was one of our parishioners. When I heard about 3 stab wounds," Detective Williams said, consulting his notepad. 2 to the chest, 1 to the heart. precise, almost surgical. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Time of death was approximately 3 in the morning, though the body wasn't discovered until Mrs. Patterson arrived for their usual Thursday morning visit. Every detail matched the confession I had heard the previous evening with terrifying exactitude. The apartment number, the neighbor's Thursday routine, the precise description of the wounds. It was as if the voice in the confessional had been reading directly from the police report that would not be written until hours later. I stumbled through the appropriate expressions of sympathy and offers of pastoral care, but my mind reeled with implications too terrible to fully accept. Either I had heard the confession of a murderer who possessed supernatural knowledge of events before they occurred, or I was losing my sanity in ways that transcended ordinary psychological breakdown. November 1st, 2024. I have spent the day attempting to rationalize what I experienced, to find some explanation that does not require me to accept either the existence of prophetic evil or my own descent into madness. Perhaps the mysterious penitent was the killer himself, confessing after the fact, but using elaborate language to create the illusion of prophecy. Perhaps my memory has become unreliable, and I am reconstructing the confession to match the crime rather than the reverse. Yet even as I craft these explanations, I know they ring hollow against the evidence of my own senses. The confession preceded the discovery of the body by 12 hours. The details were too specific, too accurate to have been fabricated or misremembered. Something spoke to me in that confessional booth last night, something that knew of Margaret Sullivan's death before the world discovered her body. The theological implications terrify me more than the criminal ones. If I have encountered a manifestation of supernatural evil, what does this suggest about the nature of my calling, my faith, my understanding of divine purpose? Am I meant to serve as witness to cosmic justice? Or have I become an unwitting participant in something that mocks the very sacraments I have devoted my life to administering? I find myself returning obsessively to the voice's final words. Grant me your blessing, and I shall continue the work that heaven has appointed. The suggestion that these murders represent divine will, rather than human evil, challenges everything I have believed about God's nature and the purpose of my priesthood. Tonight I will return to the confessional, though every instinct warns me against it. I must know whether last evening's experience was singular aberration or the beginning of something far more terrible. I must determine whether I am being called to witness divine justice, or whether I am slowly surrendering my sanity to forces that exist only in the fevered imagination of a priest who has lost his faith and found nothing to replace it but whiskey and despair. The rain has begun again, drumming against my study window with the persistence of accusations I cannot answer. In 7 hours, I will return to that narrow chamber where sins are whispered and absolution granted, where the boundary between earth and eternity grows thin enough for strange voices to penetrate the realm of mortal understanding. God help me. I am both terrified and eager to discover what waits for me in the darkness of the confessional booth. For in 20 years of hearing the same catalogue of human failures, I have hungered for something that would restore my sense of purpose, my connection to the divine mystery that first called me to this vocation. Perhaps I'm about to receive an answer to prayers I was afraid to speak aloud. Perhaps I'm about to learn that the God I have served in doubt and desperation is more terrible and more just than any theology textbook has dared to suggest. Or perhaps I am simply a lonely priest, slowly losing his mind in a confessional booth that has become the repository for guilt and madness in equal measure. Tomorrow evening, I shall discover which of these possibilities holds dominion over my fate. Until then, I can only pray that whatever waits for me in that chamber of whispered sins will prove more merciful than my own mounting dread suggests. The bells of St. Bartholomew's toll the hour of midnight, and I am no longer certain whether they announce the passage of earthly time or the approach of judgment from realms where such measurements hold no meaning. In 6 hours, I must celebrate morning mass for the faithful of Baltimore, must speak words of comfort and hope to congregation members who trust me to intercede between their souls and the divine presence I can no longer feel with certainty. But tonight, I am merely Marcus Vaughn, a man in clerical clothing who sits alone with his doubts and his whiskey, wondering whether tomorrow will bring revelation or damnation, whether the voice that spoke to me of murder and justice will return to complete whatever unholy work it has begun. The rain continues its accusatory drumming, and I find myself listening for footsteps that approach from directions no mortal feet could travel, preparing for a confession that may drag my soul into territories where absolution has no meaning and guilt becomes eternal. From the private journal of Father Marcus Vaughn, November 7th, 2024. The voice returned to my confessional exactly 7 days after Margaret Sullivan's body was discovered, arriving with the punctuality of a scheduled appointment that had been arranged in some realm beyond mortal comprehension. I had spent the intervening week in a state of nervous anticipation that bordered on madness, alternating between desperate hope that the previous Thursday's experience had been an aberration and terrified certainty that something far more sinister had taken residence in the sacred precincts of my church. During those 7 days, I attempted to conduct my pastoral duties with the appearance of normalcy, though every moment felt like an elaborate performance staged for an audience that could see through my pretense with supernatural clarity. I celebrated daily Mass with trembling hands that scattered the consecrated host, delivered homilies that wandered into theological territories I had never intended to explore, and offered comfort to parishioners whose problems seemed trivial compared to the cosmic horror that had invaded my consciousness. The investigation into Margaret Sullivan's murder proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterizes modern police work. Yet I found myself possessing knowledge that Detective Williams could never acquire through conventional means. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the killer would leave no physical evidence, that the murder weapon would never be found, that the motive would remain forever mysterious to investigators who could not access the supernatural realm where divine justice operates according to laws that transcend human understanding. When Thursday evening arrived, I entered the confessional booth with the grim determination of a soldier advancing towards certain death. The chamber felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had contracted during my week of dread, transforming what had once been a sanctuary of forgiveness into a claustrophobic prison where guilt and terror fed upon each other in an endless cycle of spiritual cannibalism. At precisely 9 o'clock, the same hour as the previous week, footsteps approached my booth with that distinctive measured cadence that seemed to echo from eternity rather than the church's marble floor. I found myself holding my breath as the familiar voice emerged from behind the carved screen, carrying within its archaic formality the weight of cosmic authority. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The words were identical to those spoken 7 days earlier, delivered with the same ceremonial precision that transformed ordinary confession into ritual proclamation. I responded with the prescribed formula, though my voice carried tremors that betrayed the magnitude of my fear. "I have delivered another soul to its appointed judgment," the voice continued without preamble. "Robert Chen, whose name appears in your parish registry, though his heart has remained closed to genuine contrition. He who accumulated wealth through the suffering of orphaned children, who built his prosperity upon the foundation of stolen charity, who presented offerings at Sunday Mass with hands stained by the tears of those he had robbed of hope." My heart hammered against my ribs with such violence that I feared it might be audible through the confessional screen. Robert Chen, I knew him well, a successful businessman who contributed generously to parish fundraising efforts and served on the finance committee with apparent dedication. Yet the voice spoke of him with the intimate knowledge of one who had examined his soul and found it wanting. "At the hour when darkness claims dominion over the commercial district," the voice continued, "when security guards pursue their solitary rounds through corridors that echo with the ghosts of financial malfeasance, I shall visit upon Robert Chen the judgment that his crimes have earned. Fire shall be his purification, not the gentle flames of purgatorial cleansing, but the consuming inferno that reduces corruption to ash and transforms greed into smoke that rises toward heaven as an offering of divine justice. The confession proceeded with the same horrifying specificity that had characterized the previous week's revelation. The voice described the precise location where Robert Chen would meet his fate, the 32nd floor of the Meridian building, where his investment firm occupied a suite of offices overlooking the inner harbor. It detailed the method by which fire would claim him, an electrical malfunction in his private office that would occur at exactly 2:17 a.m., when he would be working late to conceal evidence of his latest embezzlement. The authorities, the voice proclaimed with prophetic certainty, shall discover his remains when the sprinkler system activates and the smoke detectors summon the fire department. They will find his body seated at his desk, consumed by flames that burned with supernatural intensity, surrounded by financial documents that bear witness to his crimes, yet remain miraculously untouched by the conflagration. I attempted to interject, to demand explanations that might clarify the nature of what I was witnessing, but the voice continued with implacable authority. It spoke of Robert Chen's secret life, the charity funds diverted to personal accounts, the orphanage budgets that had been systematically looted, the children who had suffered malnutrition and inadequate medical care, so that Chen could finance his luxurious lifestyle. In confession, Robert Chen spoke of his charitable works with the pride of one who believes that public generosity can compensate for private avarice. He confessed to minor sins, impatience with his wife, occasional profanity, the pride that comes with financial success, while concealing the systematic theft that had funded his apparent philanthropy. He sought absolution for imaginary transgressions, while his real crimes remained hidden behind walls of elaborate accounting and false documentation. The voice's knowledge extended beyond mere criminal activity to encompass intimate details of Chen's psychology, his methods of self-justification, his elaborate mental structures that allowed him to view theft as business strategy and suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of personal enrichment. When the confession concluded, I sat in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend the implications of what I had heard. The voice requested absolution with the same formal courtesy as the previous week, and when I refused, it departed with the same measured footsteps that seemed to echo from realms where human law held no authority. November 8th, 2024. Robert Chen died exactly as predicted, consumed by fire in his office during the early morning hours while working alone in the Meridian building. The Baltimore Sun's coverage of the incident focused on the mysterious nature of the electrical malfunction, the unprecedented intensity of the flames that had claimed his life, and the inexplicable fact that important financial documents scattered throughout his office had emerged completely unburned from the conflagration. Detective Williams, whom I encountered at the scene when I arrived to offer last rites, confirmed details that matched the previous evening's confession with terrifying precision. The time of death, the location, the circumstances, the condition of the victim, everything unfolded exactly as the mysterious voice had described. "Strangest thing I've ever seen," Williams confided as we stood outside the burned office suite. Fire hot enough to cremate a human body. But the paper documents on his desk didn't even get singed, and the electrical system shows no signs of malfunction that could account for the intensity of the blaze. I performed the last rites with hands that shook so violently I could barely make the sign of the cross. The smell of smoke seemed to cling to my vestments long after I left the building, as if the supernatural fire had marked me as a witness to divine justice that transcended the laws of physics. November 14th, 2024. The third confession arrived with the same inexorable punctuality, delivered by the same archaic voice that spoke of murder as sacrament and violence as divine service. This time, the condemned soul was Sarah Martinez, a high school teacher whose name I recognized from the parish youth ministry records. She who corrupts the innocents she has been appointed to protect, the voice proclaimed with ceremonial gravity, who transforms her classroom into a theater of spiritual seduction, who violates the sacred trust between educator and student through the pursuit of forbidden passion. Sarah Martinez shall taste the cold embrace of water as her final communion, baptized in the harbor's depths at the hour when darkness claims the waterfront. The Voice detailed Sarah's secret affair with James Kellerman, the divorced father of one of her students, an 18-year relationship that had begun when the boy was in 8th grade and had continued through his graduation. It described clandestine meetings, manipulated grades, the systematic grooming of a vulnerable adolescent who had mistaken predatory attention for genuine affection. In Confession, Sarah Martinez spoke of her loneliness, her dedication to teaching, her maternal feelings toward her students. She confessed to moments of attraction toward adult colleagues, to fantasies of romance that she claimed remained unexpressed, to the pride that came with her reputation as an inspiring educator. Yet she concealed the reality of her crimes, the violation of professional ethics, the destruction of innocence, the betrayal of every parent who had entrusted their child to her care. The Voice's knowledge of Sarah's psychology was as comprehensive as its understanding of her crimes. It described her methods of rationalization, her ability to reframe predatory behavior as genuine love, her elaborate mental structures that transformed criminal conduct into romantic tragedy. When Thursday night became Friday morning, Sarah Martinez's body was discovered floating in the inner harbor. Her car found abandoned at the water's edge with a suicide note that confessed to inappropriate relationships with students and expressed remorse for the damage she had caused. The Baltimore Police Department ruled it suicide, though Detective Williams confided to me that the circumstances troubled him in ways he could not articulate. November 15th, 2024. I have begun to research similar phenomena in the annals of church history, seeking precedent for the supernatural experiences that have transformed my confessional booth into a tribunal where divine justice manifests through prophetic revelation. The theological implications terrify me more than the criminal ones, for if I am witnessing authentic divine intervention, what does this suggest about the nature of God's justice and my role as his earthly representative? St. Thomas Aquinas wrote of supernatural knowledge granted to certain individuals for the purpose of revealing hidden sins and preventing future transgressions. The mystics described visions of divine judgment that transcended the boundaries of linear time, allowing glimpses of future events that served the cause of cosmic justice. Yet these accounts, recorded in the safety of medieval monasteries, feel inadequate to explain the horror of my current circumstances. I have also consulted medical texts on the subject of auditory hallucinations, seeking psychological explanations for experiences that my rational mind cannot accept. Schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, the effects of chronic alcoholism, all offer potential frameworks for understanding prophetic voices that exist only in my own diseased consciousness. Yet the accuracy of the predictions argues against purely psychological explanations. The Voice knows things that I could never have discovered through natural means. It possesses intimate knowledge of my parishioners' secret lives, their hidden crimes, their methods of self-deception. Either I am receiving authentic supernatural revelation, or my subconscious mind has developed the ability to perceive truth through channels that transcend ordinary sensory experience. November 21st, 2024. The fourth confession brought news of Thomas Murphy's approaching death, described with the same ceremonial language that had announced the previous murders. Murphy, a retired construction foreman who had served as volunteer coordinator for altar servers during his 20 years in the parish, was condemned for crimes that the Voice detailed with horrifying specificity. He who corrupts the innocence of those called to serve at the altar, the Voice proclaimed, who transforms sacred space into a theater of predation, who uses his position of trust to satisfy appetites that mark him as an enemy of childhood itself. Thomas Murphy shall taste the suffocating embrace of earth as his final communion, buried beneath the weight of construction material at the site where his crimes first found expression. The confession revealed systematic abuse of altar boys that had continued for decades under the protection of Murphy's reputation as a devoted parish volunteer. The voice described specific incidents, named victims who had never reported their abuse, detailed the psychological manipulation that had ensured their silence. When Thomas Murphy died 3 days later, crushed beneath a collapsed scaffolding at a construction site where he had been working as a consultant, Detective Williams confided that the accident displayed unusual characteristics. The scaffolding had been properly erected and inspected, yet it had failed with such precise timing that Murphy had been caught directly beneath the falling debris with no opportunity for escape. November 22nd, 2024. I can no longer deny the pattern that has emerged from these supernatural confessions. Each victim had been a member of my parish who had confessed to minor sins while concealing major crimes. Each had used the sacrament of confession as a means of maintaining the appearance of spiritual health while continuing to commit offenses that destroyed innocent lives. Margaret Sullivan had protected her son from accountability for vehicular homicide. Robert Chen had stolen from charitable organizations that served orphan children. Sarah Martinez had preyed upon vulnerable students. Thomas Murphy had systematically abused the altar boys placed under his supervision. The voice that speaks to me each Thursday evening possesses knowledge that no human agency could have acquired. Intimate details of crimes that were never reported, confessions that were never made, secrets that existed only in the minds of the perpetrators themselves. Yet this knowledge is deployed not for personal gain or earthly justice, but for a form of divine retribution that transcends the limitations of human law enforcement. I have become the unwilling witness to a supernatural tribunal where hidden crimes receive their ultimate punishment, where the failures of earthly justice are corrected by intervention from realms that operate according to different principles. Each confession serves as both prophecy and verdict, announcing sentences that will be carried out with mechanical precision by forces that require no human agency to accomplish their divine purpose. The theological implications overwhelm my capacity for rational analysis. If these deaths represent authentic divine justice, what does this suggest about the nature of God's mercy and the efficacy of human forgiveness? If the confessional has become a conduit for supernatural revelation, what responsibilities does this place upon me as the priest who receives these prophetic announcements? Most troubling of all is the growing certainty that I am not merely a passive observer of these events, but an active participant in a cosmic drama whose full scope remains hidden from my conscious understanding. The voice speaks to me with familiarity that suggests previous encounters, addresses me with the assumption that I understand my role in whatever divine plan is unfolding through these supernatural confessions. Tonight, I will return to the confessional booth, though every instinct warns me against continuing this involvement with forces that may be beyond my ability to comprehend or control. I must discover whether these experiences represent divine calling or demonic deception, whether I am serving God's justice or facilitating my own spiritual destruction. The bells of St. Bartholomew's toll the hour of midnight, and I find myself listening for footsteps that approach from directions that maps cannot chart, preparing for confessions that reveal truths too terrible for mortal minds to encompass without the risk of madness. God help me. I am beginning to suspect that the mysterious voice knows things about my own hidden sins that I have not yet admitted to myself. From the private journal of Father Marcus Vaughn, November 28th, 2024. The revelation came to me not in the confessional booth where supernatural voices whisper of murder and divine justice, but in the mundane sanctity of my study, surrounded by confession records that I had kept in violation of church doctrine and my own better judgment. For 20 years, I have maintained brief, coded notations of serious confessions, not names, never names, but fragments that might help me provide better spiritual guidance to troubled souls who return to my booth seeking absolution for repeated transgressions. It was while reviewing these forbidden records that I discovered the pattern, which now fills me with horror, that transcends even my supernatural encounters with the mysterious penitent. Each victim of the prophetic murders had confessed serious sins to me within the past year, sins that bore no resemblance to the minor transgressions they revealed during their final confessions before death claimed them. Margaret Sullivan had knelt in my booth 8 months ago, weeping as she admitted to helping her son dispose of evidence after his drunken driving had claimed the life of young Maria Santos. She described washing blood from his car bumper, creating false alibis for his whereabouts, even bribing witnesses to provide contradictory testimony that would confuse any potential investigation. Robert Chen had confessed to systematic embezzlement from 3 different charities, including the Diocesan Orphanage Fund that had sustained children throughout Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods. His voice had trembled with what I mistook for genuine remorse as he detailed fictional donation reports, falsified expense accounts, and diverted construction funds that had left orphaned children living in buildings with dangerous heating systems and contaminated water supplies. Sarah Martinez had sobbed through her confession of an ongoing sexual relationship with James Kellerman, describing how she had groomed the boy from age 13, manipulated his grades to maintain his dependency, and used her position of authority to satisfy appetites that marked her as a predator of the most insidious variety. Thomas Murphy had admitted to decades of sexual abuse, naming altar boys who had never reported their victimization, and describing incidents that had occurred in the sacristy, the basement storage rooms, even within the confessional booth itself during private counseling sessions. In each case, these comprehensive confessions had been followed by months of superficial admissions, minor irritations with family members, small acts of pride or envy, the routine catalogue of human frailty that fills most confessional encounters. It was as if these parishioners had purged themselves of major sins through a single dramatic confession, then returned to the sacrament seeking absolution for imaginary transgressions while their real crimes continued unabated. The theological implications stagger my capacity for rational analysis. These individuals had used the sacrament of confession not as a pathway to genuine repentance, but as a form of spiritual insurance that allowed them to continue their criminal activities with the psychological comfort of having technically confessed their sins to God's representative. They had perverted the most sacred aspect of Catholic practice into a tool for enabling continued transgression. November 29th, 2024. I have begun a systematic investigation of the mysterious voice's true identity, though I am acutely aware that such inquiries venture into territory where conventional detective work intersects with supernatural revelation in ways that challenge the boundaries of rational inquiry. My approach has necessarily been circumspect, for I cannot reveal the source of my knowledge without violating the sacred seal of confession that binds me to eternal silence regarding matters revealed in the sacramental context. The church building itself has become my primary focus of investigation. St. Bartholomew's was constructed in 1887, its Gothic revival architecture incorporating confessional booths that were installed according to specifications established by the Council of Trent 3 centuries earlier. The mahogany chambers are separated by walls thick enough to ensure acoustic privacy, yet the voice that speaks to me each Thursday evening possesses an immediacy that suggests physical proximity rather than supernatural manifestation. I have discovered that the confessional booth contains architectural features that are not immediately apparent to casual observation. The carved wooden panels that separate priest from penitent are secured with brass hinges that have loosened over the decades, creating gaps barely visible to the naked eye, but sufficient to allow sound transmission between chambers. More disturbing still, I have found evidence that these panels have been deliberately manipulated. Scratches around the hinge pins suggest repeated removal and replacement, though I cannot determine when such alterations might have occurred. The church's security system, installed 5 years ago to prevent theft of valuable religious artifacts, includes motion sensors throughout the sanctuary, but specifically excludes the confessional area to preserve the privacy that Catholic doctrine demands. This omission creates a blind spot where someone with detailed knowledge of the building's layout could enter and exit without triggering electronic surveillance. Parish records indicate that only 7 individuals possess keys to the church building: myself, Father Williams, the assistant pastor, Mrs. Henderson, the parish secretary, and 4 members of the maintenance staff who require access for cleaning and repair work. Each of these individuals has been associated with St. Bartholomew's for at least 10 years, their backgrounds thoroughly vetted according to diocesan requirements for church employees. Yet, as I reviewed personnel files in search of someone who might possess both access to the building and knowledge of parishioners' confession secrets, I discovered irregularities that filled me with unease. The maintenance staff schedules show frequent after-hours access to the building, often during times when I cannot account for my own whereabouts. Security logs indicate building entry during evening hours when I assumed I was alone in the rectory, though I have no memory of authorizing such access or encountering anyone within the church during these periods. December 1st, 2024. The 5th confession arrived with the same punctual inevitability that has characterized each Thursday evening's supernatural visitation, but tonight's revelation carried personal implications that shattered what remained of my psychological equilibrium. The condemned soul was not a distant parishioner whose sins I had discovered through sacramental confession, but someone whose crimes struck at the very heart of my own identity and spiritual calling. "Father Daniel Morrison," the voice proclaimed with ceremonial gravity. "He who wears the garments of sanctity while harboring corruption that exceeds even the transgressions of those he pretends to guide toward salvation. His crimes transcend the violation of individual innocence to encompass the systematic destruction of faith itself, transforming the house of God into a theater of predation that mocks every sacred vow he has taken." The accusation struck me like a physical blow, for Father Morrison served as pastor of St. Michael's Parish across the city, a man I had known since seminary and considered among the most dedicated priests in the Baltimore Archdiocese. The voice's description of his crimes, systematic sexual abuse of children, financial theft from parish funds, the sale of religious artifacts to support a gambling addiction, seemed impossible to reconcile with my personal knowledge of his character and devotion. Yet the confession continued with the same horrifying specificity that had characterized previous revelations, detailing incidents that occurred in locations I recognized, naming victims whose families attended diocesan functions, describing methods of concealment that demonstrated intimate knowledge of church administrative procedures. The voice spoke of Morrison's confessions to me, confessions that I realized, with growing horror, I could not recall receiving, though the details matched coded notations in my records that I could not remember making. "Father Morrison shall taste the purifying embrace of flame as his final communion," the voice announced with prophetic certainty, "consumed within the sanctuary he has defiled, surrounded by the sacred vessels he has sold and replaced with worthless replicas, discovered by authorities who will find evidence of crimes that extend beyond individual transgression to encompass institutional corruption of the most systematic variety." When the confession concluded, I sat in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend how my own memory could contain gaps so profound that I had forgotten receiving confessions from a fellow priest whose crimes apparently rivaled those of the laity, who had already paid the ultimate price for their hidden transgressions. December 2nd, 2024. Father Morrison died exactly as predicted, consumed by fire within the sanctuary of St. Michael's during early morning hours, when he should have been sleeping in the rectory. The Baltimore Fire Department ruled it accidental, caused by faulty electrical wiring in the sanctuary's lighting system, but Detective Williams confided that the intensity of the blaze defied conventional explanation. "Strangest thing," Williams told me as I performed last rites over Morrison's remains. "Fire hot enough to reduce a human body to ash, but the wooden pews 15 feet away show no signs of heat damage. and we found evidence that suggests Morrison was selling religious artifacts and replacing them with fakes, chalices, candlesticks, even the tabernacle key. Apparently been going on for years. I mumbled appropriate responses while my mind reeled with implications too terrible to fully accept. Morrison's death followed the established pattern with mechanical precision, yet I could not recall the confessions that the mysterious voice had referenced with such detailed accuracy. Either my memory had become so compromised that I could forget receiving admissions of serious crimes from fellow clergy, or something far more sinister was occurring within the confessional booth that served as the epicenter of these supernatural revelations. December 3rd, 2024. I've begun to experience episodes of disorientation that transcend the ordinary effects of stress and sleep deprivation. This morning, I awoke in the confessional booth with no memory of how I had come to be there, wearing my full vestments despite having no recollection of preparing for liturgical duties. My breviary lay open beside me to prayers for the dead, though I could not remember conducting any funeral services recently. More disturbing still, I discovered notes written in my own handwriting scattered throughout the booth. Fragments of observations about parishioners' behavior, detailed analyses of their psychological states, speculation about sins they might be concealing. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, yet the content reflected knowledge I had never consciously acquired, and insights that seemed to emerge from sources beyond my normal cognitive processes. One note, written in script that appeared hurried and agitated, read, "Margaret Sullivan. Guilt patterns suggest concealed vehicular incident. Monitor for confession opportunities." Another stated, "Robert Chen. Financial anxiety indicates possible embezzlement. Charitable work may be compensation mechanism." A third observed, "Sarah Martinez. Inappropriate interest in male students. Predatory behavior masked by maternal persona." These observations predated the mysterious confessions by several months, suggesting that I had been unconsciously documenting my parishioners' potential for hidden sin long before the supernatural voice began announcing their crimes and punishments. The implications terrify me more than any supernatural manifestation, for they suggest that my own mind has been operating according to principles I do not consciously understand or control. December 5th, 2024. I have installed a small recording device within the confessional booth, concealed behind the carved wooden crucifix that adorns the priest's side of the chamber. This action violates every principle of sacramental privacy that governs Catholic confession, yet I must determine whether the mysterious voice represents external supernatural intervention or manifestations of my own fractured psyche. The device is voice-activated, designed to capture audio only when someone speaks within the confessional space. I have programmed it to begin recording each Thursday evening at 8:45 p.m. and continue until midnight, encompassing the time period when the prophetic confessions have consistently occurred. If the mysterious voice represents an actual person who has somehow gained access to the confessional booth, the recording will provide evidence of their identity and methods. If the voice exists only within my own diseased consciousness, the recordings will document the full scope of my psychological breakdown. I am aware that this investigation may destroy what remains of my sanity. For if I discover that the prophetic confessions emerge from my own subconscious mind, I must confront the possibility that I have somehow orchestrated the deaths of 5 people through supernatural means that transcend rational explanation. Yet I can no longer tolerate the uncertainty that has transformed my priestly vocation into a nightmare of guilt and theological confusion. December 7th, 2024. The sixth confession brought news of another impending death, delivered with the same archaic formality that has characterized each supernatural visitation. This time, the condemned soul was Maria Gonzalez, a parish secretary whose name I recognized from diocesan employment records, though I could not recall having extensive personal interactions with her. She who steals from the collection plates that contain the sacrificial offerings of the faithful, the voice proclaimed, who diverts funds intended for the poor to support her addiction to games of chance, who falsifies financial records to conceal thefts that rob food from hungry children and medicine from the sick. Maria Gonzalez shall taste the cold embrace of winter as her final communion. Discovered frozen in the alley where her shame has driven her to seek the artificial warmth of substances that promise escape from guilt but deliver only deeper bondage. The confession detailed systematic theft from multiple parishes where Gonzalez had worked over the past decade, describing methods of financial manipulation so sophisticated that they had escaped detection by diocesan auditors. The voice spoke of gambling debts that had driven her to increasingly desperate measures, of drug addiction that had consumed not only her stolen funds, but her capacity for moral reasoning. When I requested absolution with my customary refusal, the voice departed with measured footsteps that seemed to echo from directions that maps could not chart. I remained in the confessional booth until dawn, listening to the recording device that might hold evidence of either supernatural visitation or my own advancing madness. December 8th, 2024. Maria Gonzalez was found dead in an alley behind St. Patrick's Parish, her body frozen in the December cold, surrounded by drug paraphernalia and financial documents that provided evidence of embezzlement spanning multiple parishes. The medical examiner ruled her death accidental, hypothermia complicated by drug overdose, but Detective Williams observed that the timing and circumstances displayed the same inexplicable precision that had characterized previous deaths. I listened to the recording from Thursday evening's confessional session with trembling hands and a heart that hammered against my ribs with violence that threatened to burst from my chest entirely. The audio quality was clear, the voices distinct and recognizable, yet what I heard challenged every assumption I had maintained about the nature of my supernatural experiences. The recording captured two voices engaged in the familiar ritual of sacramental confession, my own voice, speaking with the prescribed formulas that govern Catholic practice, and the mysterious penitent's voice, delivering prophecies of divine justice with archaic formality. Yet both voices emerged from the same side of the confessional booth. Both voices belonged to the same speaker. Both voices were mine. The evidence was unmistakable, though my conscious mind recoiled from accepting its implications. I had been conducting elaborate conversations with myself, playing both roles in supernatural dramas that existed only within my own fractured consciousness. The prophetic confessions, the detailed knowledge of hidden crimes, the accurate predictions of future deaths, all emerged from psychological processes that operated beyond the boundaries of my rational awareness. Yet this explanation raises questions more terrifying than supernatural intervention. If the mysterious confessions represent manifestations of my own subconscious knowledge, how did I acquire such intimate details about my parishioners' secret lives? If the prophecies emerge from my own psychological processes, what does this suggest about my involvement in the deaths that have followed each prediction with mechanical precision? I can no longer deny the growing certainty that I am not merely a passive witness to divine justice, but an active participant in events whose full scope remains hidden from my conscious understanding. The confessional booth has become a theater where my fractured psyche performs dramas of guilt and retribution. Yet the deaths that follow these performances are terrifyingly real. God help me. I am beginning to suspect that the mysterious voice knows things about my own capacity for evil that I have not yet admitted to myself. Tomorrow evening, I will return to the confessional booth, though I fear that what I discover there may destroy what remains of my sanity and my soul. From the private journal of Father Marcus Vaughn, December 12th, 2024. The human mind, I have discovered, possesses an infinite capacity for self-deception, weaving elaborate tapestries of rationalization that can transform the most damning evidence into patterns of doubt and uncertainty. For 3 days, I have listened to that recording, my own voice conducting both sides of a confessional dialogue with the precision of a trained actor performing a one-man theatrical production. Yet some desperate fragment of my psyche continues to insist that supernatural forces must be responsible for what my rational mind recognizes as irrefutable proof of psychological fragmentation. The audio contains no gaps, no editing artifacts, no technical anomalies that might explain the presence of two distinct voices emerging from a single throat. My normal speaking voice, delivering the prescribed formulas of sacramental confession with the mechanical precision that 20 years of practice have instilled, alternates with the archaic, ceremonial tones of the mysterious penitent, whose prophecies have proven terrifyingly accurate. Yet both voices share subtle characteristics, patterns of emphasis, regional inflections acquired during my Baltimore childhood, even the slight rasp that results from years of liturgical speaking that mark them as products of the same vocal apparatus. I have consulted medical texts on dissociative identity disorder, reading with the desperate attention of a condemned man searching legal precedents for some technicality that might provide escape from his fate. The literature describes cases where childhood trauma fragments the developing psyche into separate personalities, each maintaining distinct characteristics, memories, and behavioral patterns while sharing the same physical form. These alternate identities can possess knowledge, skills, and psychological traits that remain completely foreign to the primary consciousness, creating the illusion of supernatural intervention when alternate personalities emerge during periods of stress or emotional triggers. Yet academic understanding provides little comfort when applied to personal experience. If I am suffering from dissociative identity disorder, what traumatic events during my childhood could have been severe enough to fracture my developing consciousness into separate entities? My memories of youth in Baltimore's working-class neighborhoods contain the usual catalogue of urban hardships: poverty, occasional violence, the constant struggle for survival in environments where hope competed with despair for dominion over daily existence, but nothing approaching the systematic abuse that psychological literature associates with multiple personality development. December 14th, 2024. I have arranged for consultation with Dr. Patricia Morrison, a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma-related disorders at Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Naturally, I could not reveal the true nature of my concerns without violating both professional ethics and legal boundaries. So I presented my case as hypothetical counseling for a parishioner experiencing religious delusions and memory disturbances. Dr. Morrison listened with the clinical attention that medical professionals reserve for complex diagnostic challenges, taking notes in a shorthand that reduced my elaborate descriptions to symbols and abbreviations that would later reconstruct themselves into formal assessment categories. Her questions probed areas I had not considered: family history of mental illness, substance abuse patterns, significant losses, or traumatic events that might have been suppressed through psychological defense mechanisms. Dissociative episodes often involve activities that the primary personality cannot recall, she explained with the careful precision that characterizes psychiatric discourse. Patients frequently discover evidence of complex behaviors, writing, traveling, even conducting relationships that occurred during periods when alternate personalities maintained executive control of consciousness. Her description matched my own experiences with horrifying accuracy. The notes written in my handwriting that I could not remember creating, the after-hours building access recorded by security systems during times when I assumed I was alone in the rectory, the gaps in memory that had grown more frequent over the past months, all suggested systematic periods when some other aspect of my consciousness had assumed control of my physical form. In cases involving religious professionals, Dr. Morrison continued, the alternate personalities often incorporate theological elements into their presentation. Patients might believe they are receiving divine revelations, communicating with supernatural entities, or serving as instruments of cosmic justice. The clinical challenge lies in distinguishing between genuine spiritual experience and psychological manifestation of trauma-induced fragmentation. When I asked about potential treatments for such hypothetical conditions, her response carried implications that filled me with dread. Successful therapy required the primary personality to acknowledge the existence of alternate identities, to understand the traumatic origins of psychological fragmentation, and to develop integration strategies that allowed different aspects of consciousness to function cooperatively rather than in competition. The most dangerous cases, she warned, involve alternate personalities that engage in activities the primary consciousness would find morally unacceptable. Criminal behavior, violence, the systematic violation of professional ethics, these can create legal and ethical crises that extend far beyond purely psychological concerns. December 16, 2024. I have begun systematic investigation into my own childhood, searching for traumatic events that might explain the psychological fragmentation that recordings have documented with irrefutable clarity. My memories of early years remain frustratingly vague, filled with gaps that I had always attributed to the normal, forgetting that accompanies the passage of time. Yet Dr. Morrison's questions have focused my attention on periods of particular confusion. Months when I lived with relatives whose names I can barely recall, visits to medical professionals whose purpose remained unexplained, behavioral changes that my mother attributed to growing pains, but which may have indicated responses to trauma too severe for conscious processing. Parish records from St. Catherine's, where I served as altar boy during my formative years, revealed details that challenge my reconstructed memories of peaceful childhood devotion. Father Vincent Kellerman, who supervised altar servers during my tenure at the parish, was transferred to a residential treatment facility in 1983 following accusations of inappropriate conduct with boys under his spiritual guidance. The diocesan files, which I accessed through professional channels, document a pattern of sexual abuse that continued for over a decade before church authorities finally intervened. My name appears on lists of altar boys who served under Father Kellerman's supervision. Yet, I possess no specific memories of individual interactions with him beyond the routine duties associated with liturgical service. The absence of clear recollections troubles me more than their presence might have, for selective amnesia often indicates psychological mechanisms designed to protect consciousness from memories too traumatic for integration into normal cognitive processes. Medical records from Baltimore Children's Hospital, obtained through requests that I justified as genealogical research, reveal multiple visits during my 11th and 12th years for symptoms that included severe anxiety, sleep disturbances, and what physicians termed behavioral regression. The attending psychiatrist recommended ongoing therapy, though insurance limitations prevented comprehensive treatment that might have addressed underlying psychological trauma. December 18th, 2024. The seventh confession arrived with the same punctual inevitability that has characterized each Thursday evening's supernatural visitation. But tonight's revelation carried personal implications that shattered what remained of my psychological defenses. This time, the condemned soul was not a distant parishioner whose hidden crimes I had discovered through professional contact, but someone whose involvement in my own traumatic history could not be ignored or rationalized away. Father Vincent Kellerman, the voice proclaimed with ceremonial gravity. He who corrupts the innocence of those called to serve at the altar, who transforms sacred space into a theater of predation, who uses his position of trust to satisfy appetites that mark him as an enemy of childhood itself. Though earthly justice failed to hold him accountable for his crimes, divine justice shall claim him through the agency of those he violated, delivering retribution that transcends the limitations of human law enforcement. The confession detailed systematic abuse that had occurred within the sacristy of St. Catherine's Parish, describing incidents that matched gaps in my own memory with terrifying precision. The voice spoke of specific locations within the church building where violations had occurred, of psychological manipulation techniques that had ensured victims' silence, of the institutional protection that had allowed predatory behavior to continue for years without effective intervention. Father Kellerman shall taste the purifying embrace of fire as his final communion, the voice announced with prophetic certainty. consumed within the residential facility where he has lived in comfort, while his victims struggle with trauma that shapes their adult relationships with faith, authority, and their own capacity for trust. His death shall occur during the hour when memories become most vivid, when the past intrudes upon the present with violence that cannot be silenced or forgotten. When the confession concluded, I remained in the booth, listening to silence that felt heavier than any sound. The recording device had captured every word of this supernatural dialogue, documenting with mechanical precision the moment when my fractured psyche finally revealed the traumatic origins of its psychological fragmentation. December 19th, 2024. Father Kellerman died exactly as predicted, consumed by fire in his private room at the St. Francis Residential Care Facility during early morning hours when most residents and staff were sleeping. The Baltimore Fire Department ruled it accidental, caused by faulty electrical wiring in his bedside lamp, though Detective Williams observed that the intensity of the blaze defied conventional explanation. Body was completely consumed, Williams told me as I performed last rites over what remained of Kellerman's corpse. Yet the mattress he was lying on shows minimal fire damage, and we found evidence in his personal effects: photographs, letters from victims, even what appears to be a detailed journal documenting decades of abuse. Like someone wanted his crimes exposed after death. I mumbled appropriate responses while my mind grappled with implications that transcended psychological explanation and entered territory where consciousness intersects with cosmic justice in ways that challenge every assumption about the nature of individual responsibility. If my alternate personality had orchestrated Kellerman's death, what did this suggest about the relationship between psychological trauma and supernatural retribution? December 21st, 2024. I have installed additional recording equipment throughout the rectory, seeking to document the full scope of my dissociative episodes and their relationship to the deaths that have followed each prophetic confession. Video cameras concealed in my study, bedroom, and private chapel now monitor my activities during hours when my conscious mind assumes I am alone and engaged in routine pastoral duties. The recordings reveal behavior that challenges my understanding of the boundaries between conscious intention and unconscious action. During periods that I remember as sleep or quiet reflection, the cameras document complex activities that suggest systematic planning and execution of detailed strategies. I observe myself reviewing parish records with methodical attention, making telephone calls to individuals I cannot recall contacting, even leaving the rectory during late evening hours for purposes that remain mysterious to my conscious awareness. Most disturbing of all, I watch myself conducting elaborate research into the personal lives of parishioners who would later become victims of the prophetic murders. I see myself accessing financial records through diocesan connections, interviewing former students and colleagues of potential targets, even conducting physical surveillance of individuals whose hidden crimes would subsequently be revealed through supernatural confession. The alternate personality that emerges during these episodes moves with purpose and intelligence that equal or exceed my own conscious capabilities. It demonstrates knowledge of investigative techniques, psychological manipulation, and criminal methodology that my rational mind has never studied or acquired through professional training. Yet this knowledge is deployed not for personal gain or malicious purpose, but in service of what appears to be a systematic campaign of divine justice that targets individuals whose crimes have escaped earthly accountability. December 23rd, 2024. The psychiatric literature describes cases where alternate personalities possess specialized knowledge, skills, and behavioral patterns that remain completely foreign to the primary consciousness. These secondary identities can emerge in response to specific psychological triggers, stress, trauma anniversaries, or situations that unconsciously replicate original traumatic circumstances. My alternate personality appears to have emerged in response to the accumulated weight of hearing confessions from individuals who use the sacrament as psychological relief valve while continuing to commit crimes that destroy innocent lives. Each false confession each superficial admission that concealed systematic abuse or theft or violence, apparently triggered dissociative episodes where my traumatized psyche assumed control and initiated justice proceedings that transcended the limitations of human law enforcement. The theological implications overwhelm my capacity for rational analysis. If my alternate personality serves as instrument of divine retribution, what does this suggest about God's methods of ensuring cosmic justice? If psychological trauma has transformed me into an agent of supernatural vengeance, how can I distinguish between authentic divine calling and elaborate delusion created by my own fractured consciousness? Most troubling of all is the growing certainty that my conscious cooperation is not required for this work to continue. The alternate personality operates with complete independence, pursuing its campaign of justice through methods that my rational mind would never approve or consciously implement. I am not merely experiencing psychological breakdown, I am discovering that I have become something beyond the boundaries of individual human consciousness, a composite entity that serves purposes larger than personal survival or professional obligation. December 24th, 2024. Tonight is Christmas Eve, the holiest night in the Christian calendar, when believers worldwide celebrate the incarnation of divine love in human form. I will celebrate midnight mass for the faithful of Baltimore, will speak words of comfort and hope to congregation members who trust me to intercede between their souls and the cosmic forces that govern human destiny. Yet I do so knowing that I am no longer entirely human, that my consciousness has been fractured by trauma into separate entities that pursue justice through methods that transcend the boundaries of individual moral responsibility. The priest who delivers tonight's homily about God's mercy and forgiveness shares physical form with an alternate personality that serves as instrument of divine retribution against those who corrupt innocence and escape earthly accountability. I have scheduled an 8th confession for tomorrow evening, though I am uncertain whether my conscious mind will be present to witness whatever revelation emerges from my fractured psyche. The pattern that has governed these supernatural visitations suggests that one final death remains to complete the cycle of justice that began with Margaret Sullivan's murder and has continued through 6 subsequent executions of divine will. I suspect that this final confession will concern my own crimes, my own failures as priest and protector of innocence, my own complicity in systems that allow predators to operate under protection of religious authority. If so, I must determine whether to resist the judgment that my alternate personality has apparently pronounced, or to accept the justice that my own traumatized consciousness believes I deserve. The bells of St. Bartholomew's toll the hour of midnight, announcing the arrival of Christmas Day and the celebration of divine love's triumph over human corruption. Yet I find myself listening for footsteps that approach from directions that maps cannot chart, preparing for a final confession that may reveal whether I am instrument of God's justice or victim of my own shattered sanity. In 6 hours, I must stand before my congregation and proclaim the good news of salvation through divine mercy. Tonight, I can only pray that whatever emerges from my confessional booth tomorrow evening will prove more merciful than the justice I fear I have been chosen to embody. From the private journal of Father Marcus Vaughn. December 25th, 2024. Christmas morning arrived with the pale winter light that filters through Baltimore's industrial haze, casting the city in shades of grey that match the desolation within my soul. I celebrated midnight mass with mechanical precision, delivering homilies about divine mercy and redemption, while knowing that my own capacity for either had been consumed by psychological fires that burned beyond the reach of conventional forgiveness. The congregation sang carols with voices that carried the hope of salvation, their faces illuminated by candlelight that transformed the sanctuary into a theatre of sacred beauty. Children gazed with wonder at the nativity scene, their innocence intact and unmarked by knowledge of the corruption that can flourish even within institutions dedicated to protecting virtue. Families gathered in peaceful communion, trusting that their priest could intercede between their souls and the cosmic forces that govern human destiny. Yet I stood before them knowing that I was no longer entirely human, that my consciousness had been fractured by trauma into separate entities, pursuing justice through methods that transcended individual moral responsibility. The priest who spoke words of comfort shared physical form with an alternate personality that served as instrument of divine retribution, or elaborate delusion created by psychological breakdown, too profound for rational comprehension. When the service concluded and the last parishioner departed into the winter night, I returned to the rectory with the certainty that tonight would bring the final confession in a cycle that had begun 8 weeks ago with Margaret Sullivan's prophetic murder. The pattern that governed these supernatural visitations demanded completion, and I suspected that this ultimate revelation would concern my own crimes, my own failures, my own judgment rendered by the fractured psyche that had appointed itself executor of cosmic justice. December 25th, 2024, evening. I entered the confessional booth at 8:45 p.m., positioning myself within the mahogany chamber that had become my purgatory, my tribunal, my prison. The recording equipment hummed softly in concealment behind the carved crucifix, prepared to document whatever final drama would unfold between the conscious priest and the unconscious avenger who shared my physical form. At precisely 9 o'clock, I felt the familiar shift in consciousness that marked the emergence of my alternate personality. Yet tonight proved different from previous supernatural visitations, for I remained partially aware even as the other identity assumed executive control. I became spectator to my own psychological transformation, watching with horrified fascination as my body language changed, my vocal patterns shifted, and my entire behavioral presentation metamorphosed into something foreign yet intimately familiar. "Bless me, Father," I heard myself say in the archaic, ceremonial tones that had characterized each prophetic confession, "for I have sinned." But this time, the response came from my conscious awareness rather than the prescribed ritual formulas. "How long has it been since your last confession?" The dialogue that followed transcended ordinary conversation to become an interrogation conducted between different aspects of my fractured psyche, each possessing distinct memories, motivations, and moral frameworks while sharing the same physical form. "I confess to 7 murders," the alternate personality proclaimed, with the matter-of-fact precision that had characterized previous supernatural revelations. 7 acts of divine justice delivered upon souls whose crimes exceeded the boundaries of human forgiveness, whose corruption demanded intervention from agencies that operate beyond the limitations of earthly law enforcement. My conscious mind recoiled from this admission, yet I found myself compelled to pursue the theological implications. Murder violates the commandment that prohibits the taking of human life. How can such acts serve divine purpose? Divine justice transcends human law when earthly authority fails to protect innocence from systematic destruction. Margaret Sullivan enabled vehicular homicide through maternal corruption. Robert Chen stole from orphaned children to finance personal luxury. Sarah Martinez preyed upon vulnerable students entrusted to her care. Thomas Murphy violated altar boys within sacred spaces. Father Morrison betrayed every vow of his ordination. Maria Gonzalez robbed from collection plates intended for charitable works. Father Kellerman destroyed childhood innocence through predatory abuse. The catalogue of crimes was delivered with clinical precision, each transgression documented with the thoroughness of a prosecutor presenting evidence to cosmic tribunal. Yet my conscious awareness demanded accountability for methods that violated every principle of Christian mercy. By what authority do you pronounce such judgments? By what right do you execute sentences that transcend human jurisdiction? By the authority of trauma that transforms victimization into purpose, violation into mission, powerlessness into divine agency. The boy who suffered in silence while predators operated under protection of religious authority has become the man who ensures that such crimes receive their ultimate accountability. The alternate personality's response revealed the psychological architecture that supported its sense of divine mission. Childhood trauma had created a secondary identity that possessed both the knowledge necessary to identify hidden criminals and the emotional detachment required to orchestrate their destruction. This vigilante consciousness operated according to moral principles that transcended individual human law, serving what it perceived as cosmic justice that corrected the failures of earthly authority. Yet murder remains murder, regardless of motive or justification. How can taking life serve the cause of justice when it violates the fundamental principle that human existence is sacred? Existence ceases to be sacred when it is devoted to the systematic destruction of innocence. These individuals forfeited their right to continued life through crimes that corrupted the moral order itself. Their deaths serve as both punishment for past transgressions and prevention of future violations. The theological debate continued for nearly an hour, my conscious mind arguing for mercy and redemption, while the alternate personality insisted upon justice and accountability. Yet beneath this philosophical discourse lay a more fundamental question. Which aspect of my fractured consciousness represented authentic moral authority? My conscious awareness had enabled systematic abuse through willful ignorance, professional compliance, and institutional loyalty that protected predators while abandoning their victims. The alternate personality had taken decisive action against criminals who escaped earthly accountability, serving as instrument of justice that transcended the limitations of human law enforcement. December 26, 2024. The recording from last evening's confessional session documented the complete conversation between my conscious awareness and alternate personality, providing audio evidence of psychological fragmentation so profound that it challenged conventional understanding of individual identity and moral responsibility. Yet this mechanical documentation could not resolve the fundamental question that tortured my remaining sanity. Which aspect of my consciousness serves authentic divine purpose? The alternate personality operates with knowledge, skills, and moral certainty that my conscious mind has never possessed. It demonstrates investigative capabilities that exceed my professional training, psychological insight that surpasses my theological education, and commitment to justice that shames my own record of institutional compliance. If this secondary identity represents manifestation of divine will rather than psychological illness, then my conscious resistance to its methods constitutes obstruction of cosmic justice. Yet accepting this interpretation requires abandoning every assumption about the nature of human responsibility, individual consciousness, and the relationship between trauma and moral authority. It demands recognition that some violations of innocence create obligations that transcend conventional legal and ethical boundaries, obligations that can only be fulfilled through methods that human law would classify as criminal. December 28, 2024. I have made the decision that will determine whether my remaining years serve penance or purpose, integration or destruction. Rather than seeking psychiatric treatment that would attempt to suppress or eliminate the alternate personality, I choose to establish conscious cooperation with the aspect of my psyche that has proven more effective at protecting innocence than 2 decades of conventional priestly service. This choice requires accepting responsibility for 7 murders, while acknowledging that these deaths serve justice that earthly authority had failed to provide. It demands recognition that my conscious compliance with institutional protection of predators constituted greater moral failure than my unconscious orchestration of divine retribution against criminals who escaped human accountability. The alternate personality will continue its work, but now with conscious knowledge and deliberate cooperation rather than unconscious autonomy. I will serve as willing instrument of cosmic justice that operates beyond the boundaries of human law, protecting innocence through methods that transcend conventional moral limitations. January 15th, 2025. 3 weeks have passed since I achieved conscious integration with the alternate personality that shares my physical form. The transition has proven less dramatic than psychological literature suggests, perhaps because both aspects of my consciousness serve compatible purposes despite employing different methods. My conscious awareness now possesses access to knowledge and skills that the secondary identity had developed during months of unconscious investigation. I understand techniques of criminal research, psychological manipulation, and strategic planning that exceed anything taught in seminary education. Most importantly, I have acquired the emotional detachment necessary to identify and eliminate threats to innocence without being paralyzed by conventional moral inhibitions. The 9th confession will occur tomorrow evening, though this time I will consciously participate in selecting the target and orchestrating the execution of divine justice. Detective Williams has begun investigating connections between the previous murders, though his inquiries remain focused on external perpetrators rather than internal church personnel. His investigation will fail, as all previous investigations have failed, because cosmic justice operates through agencies that transcend human detection. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the parish treasurer, who has been systematically embezzling funds designated for homeless services, will experience her final judgment within 72 hours. Her crimes, diverting money intended for shelter operations to finance gambling addiction, have resulted in deaths from exposure among Baltimore's most vulnerable population. Such systematic murder through financial theft demands accountability that exceeds the mild restitution that civil courts would impose. February 14th, 2025. The work continues with mechanical precision, each execution serving cosmic justice while maintaining the appearance of accidental death that prevents earthly authority from interfering with divine purpose. Mrs. Morrison died as predicted, followed by 3 other criminals whose hidden transgressions had escaped human accountability. I have established protocols that ensure sustainable operation while minimizing detection risks. Targets are selected through systematic review of confession records, parish financial documents, and behavioral observation that identifies individuals whose public virtue conceals private corruption. Investigation methods verify criminal activity before execution orders are pronounced. Death procedures are designed to appear accidental, while ensuring that evidence of hidden crimes is discovered during subsequent investigations. The theological framework that supports this work has evolved beyond conventional Catholic doctrine to encompass principles of cosmic justice that transcend denominational boundaries. Divine retribution operates through human agencies when earthly authority fails to protect innocence from systematic destruction. Individual moral responsibility includes obligation to serve as instrument of cosmic justice when conventional legal and religious institutions prove inadequate to prevent continued victimization. June 1st, 2025. 6 months have passed since I achieved conscious integration with the aspect of my psyche that serves divine justice through methods that transcend human law. The work has expanded beyond individual executions to encompass systematic reformation of institutional corruption that enables predatory behavior. 3 diocesan officials have experienced final judgment for their roles in protecting abusive clergy. 2 parish administrators have been eliminated for embezzling charitable funds. 4 teachers and volunteer coordinators have paid ultimate accountability for predatory behavior toward children under their supervision. Detective Williams's investigation has been quietly transferred to federal authorities, though their inquiries continue to focus on external perpetrators rather than internal church personnel. The pattern of accidental deaths among individuals subsequently discovered to have committed serious crimes generates suspicion, but no actionable evidence that could compromise continued operations. I celebrate Mass each Sunday for congregations that trust me to intercede between their souls and cosmic forces that govern human destiny. My homilies speak of divine mercy and forgiveness, while my actions ensure that mercy remains available only to those whose transgressions do not include systematic destruction of innocence. The confessional booth continues to serve as tribunal where hidden crimes receive their ultimate judgment, though now through conscious cooperation between priest and executioner rather than unconscious psychological fragmentation. Divine justice operates through human agencies that have been purified by trauma into instruments capable of transcending conventional moral limitations. Final entry, date unknown. I write these concluding words knowing that Detective Williams' investigation has finally identified patterns that point toward internal church involvement in the systematic elimination of hidden criminals. Federal authorities will soon focus their inquiries on parish personnel rather than external perpetrators, threatening operations that have served cosmic justice for over a year. Yet the work is complete in ways that transcend individual continuation. 37 executions have demonstrated that divine retribution operates through human agencies when earthly authority fails to protect innocence. The message has been delivered to institutional corruption with sufficient clarity that future predators will understand the ultimate accountability that awaits those who abuse positions of trust. My conscious integration with the alternate personality that serves cosmic justice has achieved purpose that transcends personal survival or professional obligation. The traumatized boy, who suffered in silence while predators operated under protection of religious authority, has become the man who ensured that such crimes receive their ultimate punishment. If earthly authority succeeds in terminating these operations through legal intervention, cosmic justice will manifest through other agencies, other instruments, other human vessels who have been purified by trauma into willingness to transcend conventional moral limitations. Divine retribution operates according to principles that exceed human jurisdiction, principles that will continue whether individual servants live or die. The confessional booth of St. Bartholomew's has fulfilled its ultimate purpose, serving not merely as chamber where sins are whispered and conventional absolution granted, but as tribunal where cosmic justice intersects with human consciousness to ensure that innocence receives protection that transcends the limitations of earthly law. I close this journal knowing that whatever judgment earthly authority pronounces upon my actions, cosmic justice has been served through methods that exceed human comprehension. The systematic protection of innocence justifies any personal cost, any professional sacrifice, any individual destruction that such service demands. Bless me, Father, for I have served divine purpose through human agency, cosmic justice through earthly action, ultimate accountability through methods that transcend the boundaries of conventional moral understanding. Amen. Police report addendum: Father Marcus Vaughn was found dead in the confessional booth of St. Brate Payne, Charles Bartholomew's Catholic Church on June 15, 2025. Cause of death was determined to be self-inflicted carbon monoxide poisoning. His journal provided evidence linking him to 37 unsolved deaths over an 18-month period. All victims were subsequently discovered to have committed serious unreported crimes. Investigation concluded that Father Vaughn suffered from severe dissociative identity disorder resulting from childhood sexual abuse. Case closed.